The Legal Mindset Corner will begin after a brief word from today's sponsor, Answering Legal. Visit answeringlegal.com to learn more about our 24/7 virtual receptionist team.
I've been utilizing Answering Legal for my firm since 2015, and truth be told, it was a game changer for me. I can be anywhere, and I'm getting my phones answered by Answering Legal. A strategic partner, as I call Answering Legal, provides a great reward. What is that reward? It's time. Time for whatever I want to do. As a private practitioner, I would highly recommend Answering Legal to other private practitioners. Now, every call goes answered.
Welcome back to the Legal Mindset Corner, hosted by our friends at Answering Legal. I am your host, Becky Howlett, along with my co-host, Cynthia Sharp. And here at the Legal Mindset Corner, we're devoted to covering a range of lawyer well-being topics, including work-life integration, implicit bias, resilience, and more. So today's episode, we're going to be examining navigating bias and building trust, fostering empowerment and respect while representing vulnerable clients. And we are so happy to be joined today by our special guest, Nadia Igram. Nadia is a legal aid attorney and doula in the Kansas City area. She actually founded Divas and Doulas, which is a birth doula and legal services organization here in Kansas City. And after having a particularly positive birth experience with the birth of her third child in 2018, Nadia formulated a plan to help as many women as possible have similarly satisfying birth experiences. So she was really motivated, said she had heard way too many stories of births that did not go as planned, new parents who are oftentimes had a general feeling of being ignored or being treated poorly. And so that really inspired her to start this organization. So Kindred Spirit, that's why we had to have her on. But I just have to read a little bit about Divas and Doulas because this is such an amazing concept. So it says, Divas and Doulas was born out of the belief that every expectant parent, regardless of identity, socioeconomic status, age, or background, deserves a positive, healthy, and satisfying birth experience. It is an organization that is committed to ensuring expected parents are the center of attention and that they feel respected and heard, and that low-income parents have access to the services that have innumerable benefits that would otherwise be out of reach. So Nadia now provides birth doula services as well as related legal services and utilizes an income-based sliding scale fee system to help ensure that her clients always have access to these services. So again, thank you so much for joining us here today, Nadia. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here with you too.
Welcome.
And I just have to say how we found out about you. So we were all presenters recently at Kansas City Metropolitan Bar Association's annual Wellbeing Summit. And Nadia was the presenter before Cindy and I, and we were just telling her that we were jumping up and down out of our seats because she was raising concepts like secondary trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And we were just like, who is this woman? We need to know her. And so we're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was so fun to do that talk and just to get the email from both of you afterwards, like, hey, we saw your talk and we'd love to have you. I was just kind of floored. I did not, like we were talking about beforehand, I couldn't see anybody. I had no idea that there was that kind of response. So I'm really, really grateful for both of you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And so again, we just feel like you're such a kindred spirit because not only are you an attorney, but then you've also pivoted to kind of like go into a really, create your own thing where there was a void and a need. So we'd love to hear more about your journey launching Diva and Doulas and just what inspired you on this path.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it definitely kind of came out of left field for me. I had obviously knew what doulas were, learned about them a bit in college because one of my professors was training to be a doula at the time. And I have a sister-in-law who has quite a few kids. So I got, she kind of always took the natural path to birth. So I got a lot of experience and a lot of exposure that way. But it was never anything I thought I really want to do this. I don't really like I'm not super touchy feely. I'm not into, the medical profession and being in that side of things. But so it was certainly nothing that I ever expected. But then I had, like you mentioned before, I had very positive birth experiences myself. My third child was born with the assistance of a midwife here in Kansas City. And it really kind of, after hearing so many instances of other people not having that experience, I thought, I've already dedicated my legal work to being, as a legal aid attorney, and then transitioning to private practice, but sort of legal aid in the sense that I provide sliding scale fees with that as well, and do quite a bit of pro bono work in that realm. It became kind of the natural transition to add on that service as well, to be able to provide something that honestly, I think should just be a right of everybody to have. I think, that doula services generally are not covered by insurance. They're not covered by medical assistance programs. And they should be, because there are so many positive benefits, not just to the individuals that are having the birthing experience, but to the society as a whole. You get parents, or, a parent who's able to bond with their child better if they've had less interventions and that kind of thing. And there's just so much positive impact that comes out of that. So for me, it just became another way that I could tack on another thing that I could advocate for, because I also saw my legal aid clients and my, clients through my private practice that were, they would have a limited assistance, limited support in so many areas of their life. And this was one thing that I knew that I could do. And my first birth was mind blowing. And to a certain point, I was like, oh my God, I did that 3 times. And it was just like, kind of but also like, this was such an incredible experience. And everyone after that, even with, some trauma that I've experienced with birthing clients and beyond, it's such a different and positive way to get people through that experience, and to come out with something that they can look back on and be proud about, whether they, everything went smoothly, or even if it didn't, they were able to advocate for themselves because they had somebody by their side who was helping them advocate for what they wanted.
Well, Nadia, one of the reasons that I really enjoy my work with Becky is that I am always learning. And when I heard that you were a birth doula, I certainly had heard of doula, and I heard of birth doula, but I know more about death doulas. Mm-hmm. And so I was very intrigued when I looked at your website and saw the definition of doula as being woman who serves. Mm-hmm. And that just seems to say it all. Right. So I love the concept that you've come up with.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really amazing. It's been an amazing part of my journey, and I'm so glad. I don't get to focus on it as much. I still do doula work, but also the legal side takes over sometimes, but it's incredible. It's incredible work to do.
I would love to, you spoke about that you really view this should be a right, and so many of these positive benefits. And obviously, you are a legal aid attorney and you do work with a lot of marginalized clients. And I know you had talked about that in your previous session where we heard you speak. Can you speak more to that? Some of the challenges of, representing marginalized clients and how you meet those challenges?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I come at it from a few different perspectives. One, as the legal aid attorney, which kind of naturally means you're helping lower income individuals. So there's that group of marginalized individuals that need resources, they need access that they can't otherwise afford. So when I started, one way that I tried to help that group of individuals when I became more of on the private side, but with the sliding scale fee and volunteering with legal aid, was I created the sliding scale fee specifically to cover that gap, right? There's that income gap of folks who either, don't qualify for legal aid because of their income standards, but also don't have the funds for a $5,000, $10,000 advance fee for a private attorney, but need access to the legal system. So that was one way that I tried to, and continue to try to, kind of fill that gap in between. Because even when I was full-time with legal aid, we would get so many people so many intakes who either the problem just wasn't quite, it didn't fit the very limited problem areas that we could focus on, especially for family law, because we had to only take, there was such a need that we had to limit the type of cases that we could take, right? So we would take those that had the most severe domestic abuse. Some cases we could refer to volunteer attorneys, but not everyone. Or we'd get, like I said, those cases where the client made just a little bit too much to qualify. So in my own and I do this both for my doula practice and legal practices, I created a sliding scale system that honestly I fudge all the time. So if you're going to land at like that $150 an hour standpoint, I usually give you a discount. I drop you down a little bit more. I maybe don't count all the times that we talk on the phone. So I'm really not very good at even sticking to my own standards, because I really am a legal aid attorney at heart. I can't get that part out of me. And it doesn't matter, like I said, if it's for birth clients or legal clients. It's just, it's ingrained in me. The other way that I really try to use my own experience, both professional and personal experience in representing marginalized folks, is, I'm an Arab Muslim woman who was born and raised in Iowa, which is not a terribly diverse part of the country. I was in Cedar Rapids, so the Muslim community there has been there for a really, really long time. My family came over, my great-grandfather came over 100 years ago, but it was also at a time when folks really tried to assimilate. So they started changing their names, Khalil became Charlie, and that was my grandfather, and those types of things happened. So there was a lot of my life too, my childhood was kind of becoming reacquainted with my own background. And so that transition then into how I represent my clients, I know what it's like to be one in, a room of 150 of looking like me, being of my background. So I use my own personal experience, and I understand how the legal system hasn't quite caught up to the diversity and inclusion world. We're working on it. We're getting there slowly. The medical profession as well is still, they've got to redo a whole bunch of textbooks and implicit biases in doctors and nurses and stuff like that. So I also know that it takes patience and time for them to catch up. And in the meantime, I'm kind of that conduit between the two, right? Between my clients and between the folks who are assisting them or who have that kind of position of power in determining the outcome of their circumstance. So I have used my experience individually and personally, as well as professionally, to kind of help navigate those systems with my clients. And also, I have that benefit, especially as a birth doula, when I come in and they know I'm an attorney, it does give me a little bit of an edge because they're a little bit more afraid.
I thought you were going to say they trust me more.
That too. They're also a little bit more afraid. Take me a little bit more seriously. Let's put it that way. But, they tend to be a little bit more cautious, which honestly works in my clients' favors, because then they can voice a lot of their concerns a lot more that are received a lot better than if I didn't have the education and professional background that I do.
Well, and that's what really brings me to that I know that one of your missions is for your clients in your doula profession to feel respected and heard, because there's so much listening should be a required course. Active listening should be required of all of us when we're in grade school. But how have you been able to transition that philosophy of making them feel respected and heard into your legal practice?
Mm-hmm. It's a little bit harder. It's funny because I started there, right? So I had to become an active listener there first, but it's a very different type of advocacy. And it's also very different in terms of the outcome that you are giving your clients as an option. So in the legal profession, especially since I do primarily family law, because that's where the biggest crossover is, that and, some, preparing powers of attorney and stuff like that. But a lot of times with family law, you have your client who wants the sun and the moon, and the other side also wants the sky and the stars, and they're going to end up somewhere closer to the ground. And it's a lot of tempering those expectations. And it's very difficult because it does sometimes come off as, I'm not feeling heard, you're not listening, you're not doing what I want you to do as my attorney, you're not fighting hard enough for me. Where in the doula world, it's, you want the birth experience that you want, we can absolutely get there. Of course, you have to plan for certain, unexpected situations to come up. A cord gets wrapped around a baby's neck a few times or something like that. But generally speaking, that outcome is much more attainable. When your birth client wants the sun and the moon, they can 9 times out of 10, they're going to get the sun and the moon. So that's the first challenge. And I was already an active listener. So transitioning that to the birth world was easy, but transitioning that ability to make sure my clients felt heard and respected kind of back was a little bit more challenging, because I really had to kind of focus on, okay, well, I've got 2 very different sets of expectations and outcomes that are going to be the most likely outcome, right? So how do I make sure the client understands that, while also understanding that I am doing whatever I can, and I'm here to help, to listen, and to help in the best ways that I can within the guidelines of my profession. So one thing I do is I make it very clear to my clients up front, like, I am here for you. I come without judgment, especially dealing with a lot of victims of domestic abuse. I come without judgment. I understand that you may go back. I get that, and I know all the reasons that are going to lead you to go back. I understand. I can tell you what the legal ramifications are. And if I can, whether or not I can represent you later on, but know that I will always be here as an emotional support, and I will never judge you for your decisions, because I know that society is not structured to help and support you in the way that you need. So that's okay. So I really, and a lot of times there is a lot of overlap too with birth doulas. It's listening to what they want, and even helping them, because a lot of times they don't necessarily know how to form a birth plan. They don't know what all the things that they're going to experience in a birth situation. So, helping them kind of understand what is going to happen and how to plan for that. But also letting them know that, look, if you tell me now that you don't want an epidural and you're in so much pain, you want an epidural, again, no judgment. There will be absolutely no judgment. You don't need to know my birth stories unless you ask. I'm not going to impose what I did on you, but I also know that it's painful. It is a very difficult experience. And if you change your mind, just like with my domestic abuse clients, if you change your mind halfway through, this is your experience. It's not mine. And so I make that's kind of one way that I've been able to do, with both sets of clients, is I make that upfront and understandable to both of them, that this is their case. This is their birth experience. I'm here to help you get as best of an outcome as you can get, but also know that you are the one who is making the decisions, and I will respect your decisions without judgment.
Well, I kind of understanding on your part, and that you're able to convey in a believable way from the heart, you only get that from great experience and compassion on your part. And it's a matter of a good lawyer knows their client and knows
Right.
their client type, and you
Right.
obviously do.
And I remember in law school, this was several years ago, my constitutional law professor, I was called up, the Socratic method, they just pick on you, right? So I was called one day, I was not prepared, because I didn't realize the person in front of me had dropped out. So I didn't know it was my turn, but it was my turn. And I thankfully I had skimmed the case. So he called on me and asked me a question. I started with, I think something, 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 or I believe. I can't remember exactly if I said I think or I believe, but one of those. And he looked at me and he goes, "You're not a person, you're a lawyer. I don't care what you think or you believe. It's what the case says." And I was blown away by that. And at the time I was kind of flabbergasted, right? I'm like, how can I separate myself as a person and a lawyer? To me, that doesn't make sense. I got it a little bit more throughout the years and throughout practicing. I understand that you have to separate yourself to a certain extent. I also know that I'm not the type of person who can 100% separate myself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't breach those professional levels, but at the same time, if I completely divorce my person as an individual self with care and compassion and kindness from myself as a lawyer, I am not going to be serving my clients the way they need to be served. And a lot of that is because I'm dealing with more vulnerable clients than a lot of attorneys or doulas deal with anyway. So I've learned that, through, like you said, through experience, through practice, that those two things have to go hand in hand to a certain extent, right? Your person, yourself, and your attorney self, because that's the best way that I can advocate for my clients when they are in oftentimes, situations where they have to choose between their physical well-being and having childcare. It's not, these are real life experiences that folks are dealing with. And it's shocking sometimes. I mean, I've had clients who have had really horrible experiences and they go back because of whatever reason they need to go back. And so I can't I can't just be the lawyer in that moment. I also have to be the caring and compassionate person for them.
How do you not take it home with you?
I'm still working on that. To be honest. I find outlets for myself. I have, a husband and 3 kids. I obviously can't tell them all the things that I hear, right? Because of confidentiality. But I think I've learned how to compartmentalize a little bit better than I did 10 years ago when I started. And I find outlets for that. So it's, I use those experiences also to kind of indirectly teach my children too. This is how you treat people, right? I do bring it home to a certain extent as I turn it into a teaching moment so that my kids don't become, those types of people who aren't compassionate or who would, God forbid, inflict any harm on somebody. I bring it home and tell them, you have to be kind to everybody. You need to be, respectful of everybody that you encounter. Treat people with kindness and compassion. So that's one way that I do bring it home with me, kind of intentionally. But like I said, the other way is I find, we don't have therapists working in legal aid. There was no therapist or social worker, down the hall who I could go sit and talk to. We had each other, but that's not always enough. So I have found ways to kind of let off some of that stress and some of that kind of built up, it just sits with you sometimes. And it can be as simple as, disappearing for a couple hours to go to a coffee shop by myself. Or I started a soccer moms group. Most of us have not played soccer before, by the way. It's hilarious. But we play soccer's Monday nights at All American. I know that I am going to continue to be that person that does bring it home with me. I am. That's just who I am. It's how I'm built. And so recognizing that in myself and knowing what my own limitations and boundaries are have actually helped me cope with it a lot better.
Yeah, because you mentioned the trauma that you've experienced in some of your clients' birth processes, and that, of course, makes me think of secondary trauma, of vicarious traumatization, exactly what we're talking about. That, but that's so interesting because that's like you're there, so it's kind of a primary traumatic experience for you. Right. But how did you recognize this, Nadia, that, the importance and the significance of taking that time for yourself, of actively creating those outlets? Do you have any stories from your own experiences?
Sure. Yeah. And I think the first step was recognizing that it was secondary trauma, right? We spoke about this before we started recording, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was pre-pandemic. I was doing a CLE for Iowa because I have licenses in a few different states. So I was finishing those requirements. And that was the first time I had really ever heard, I knew what trauma was, right? I know what PTSD is. I've had clients who have suffered from those types of things and everything. And I knew trauma and I know what re-traumatization is and things that are going to trigger folks. I didn't know what secondary trauma was before then. I'd never heard of it. But in that CLE, I heard of it. And my mind was just completely blown. And I was like, okay, so now I understand what these things are, why I feel like I can't do any work today, or why I feel like I'm hitting a wall or I'm burnt out or whatever. So that was the first step, was just recognizing what was happening. And then I could go from there and think, all right, well, I need to talk to some other folks who, like, how do they address this? And I talk to friends who are attorneys. I talk to friends who are therapists, because they are also dealing with a lot of secondary trauma and just hearing the same things over and over again from a lot of their clients as well. So I started by recognizing what it was. And, I tell myself all the time, like, I'll make time for the things that I need to do, right? I'll go see a therapist. Probably should. I'll do self-care. And I mean, the reality is I haven't been perfect at addressing those things. There are things that I know I should be doing to help, but time is limited, right? And family is always around and needing something from me. So I've had to just kind of be creative with that. I've had to figure out, okay, well, here are the things that I know are going to relieve stress. Here are the things that I know are going to make me happy. Here are the things that I know it might make me happy for an hour, but then it'll have this longer lasting effect. Here are the things that I know that I can do to just remove myself from the secondary trauma. And like you said, even with a client of mine who lost a baby, while we were in the hospital with that primary trauma as well. And it's just, it has taken a lot of time, But a lot of it just started with, I do a lot of kind of deep introspection. Like, this is what I'm feeling. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I responding to this particular situation in this way? And how can I fix it? I'm very much an analytical person and a logical person. So if I am responding to anything that I perceive to be illogical in an illogical manner, I'm like, wait a second, something's off and I need to correct it. So I make sure I take those steps to like really examine why things are happening in me the way that they are and how I can fix it. And also, you know, it's been really, really hard for me to ask for help. I'm a deeply individual person when it comes to like getting things done. And I also know that that comes from, you know, years of needing help in certain ways and not getting it. So I also know that that's also a trauma response. So I know that I've had to kind of go outside of myself a little bit and lean on some folks like, hey, I just need 5 minutes. You know, I just need to kind of vent this out. I need to talk to you about this. I need to get an idea of how I can move past it so that I can keep serving my clients with my best self, as opposed to this diminished, you know, person that I am right now. That's kind of how that's how I've gotten through and continue to hopefully get through, you know, the chaos that is my life, but also just how I can best serve my clients going forward.
Oh, that ability to have that introspection's really incredible.
Thank you.
I love how you explain that.
Yeah,
like for attorneys. You know, because we promote mindfulness, and so many times attorneys are like, oh, that's, you know, like that's woo woo, or, you know, but I love how you explain the process of deep introspection and contemplation, and how you know, are wedding it to a logical process. I just found it very, gosh, Nadia, I'm just like, where do you work? Like, I want to like send people to you, like, oh my gosh, I'm just thank you so much. We're fangirling over you.
I am so like just blushing right now because I'm not used to this attention right now. So
just so with it, she's like humble too.
Exactly.
Like,
and you're really describing developing resilience. And I know that in one of our programs, we talk about resilience, and Becky has found the statistics that the older that you get, the more resilient you become, because first of all, you discover that there are tools. You don't have to be like this all the time. And then you're actually mature enough to take the time to apply those tools. So kudos to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely been you know, I respond now very differently than I did when I started practicing 11 years ago, which is good. It's a good thing. So yeah, it's definitely taken time, but and I think to a certain extent, some of those things were kind of built into me throughout my childhood too. I mean, I grew up, my mom is an immigrant. She grew up during Civil War in Lebanon. So I think a lot of those pieces of resilience too were kind of built into me as a child, and I've just been able to hone it a lot more. And like you said, Becky, like with, you know, attorneys kind of scoff at this idea because I think a lot of it stems from public perception of what we're supposed to be and who we are, right? Public perception sees us as a little less human, a little more cold, a little more stone-like. It's and that honestly, that piece of it affects me more than what my clients deal with sometimes, because I'm like, I promise you, we are not the enemy in the room. You have thrust us into these situations where life is terrible for you right now, and you expect us to like come in and fix it, and inevitably one side is going to see us as the enemy. But we're also just people who are trying to get through this. So I think we've kind of built up a shell to help bounce those perceptions off of us so that they don't stick. And to me, I'm just like, well, okay, I get we need to have that resilience in dealing with that, but also we have to address what's happening to us and fix it from the inside out. Public perception is probably not going to change anytime soon. I mean, Jonathan Swift wrote in, you know, Gulliver's Travels, however many years ago, a lawyer will tell you that black is white and white is black. It's not going to change anytime soon. But if we learn the tools and how to deal with that ourselves, we won't turn to all the other negative coping methods that a lot of attorneys have had to have dealt with. So that's kind of where we are as a profession.
And I was thinking, didn't Shakespeare dog on attorneys? I mean, it's
Oh, yeah.
like it's deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness. But to that point, Nadia, about bias, both explicit and implicit, unconscious biases that you're saying you're encountering the negative effects of those in practice. Can you speak more to that? Because again, you said you're a Muslim female attorney. You grew up in Iowa. It's funny, Cedar Rapids, that's like the only place in Iowa I know, because one of my best friends from high school, like their family moved there. So I'm like, I know Cedar Rapids. I used to road trip there. It's like, it's so nice there.
It's a quiet place.
Yeah. But back to the point being that, because I think when we came up with the theme for this episode, we were really thinking about bias in terms of, bias towards our clients. But I was not thinking of bias on, coming back towards us. So I'd love to hear more on your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it honestly kind of swirls around us like a tornado in the Midwest, right? It's just always that threat that's there. But it's, with my client, with attorneys, obviously we deal with it within ourselves too. We bring these implicit biases into the practice. And so one way that I've encountered it is I walk into a room, whether it's a courtroom or, a conference room to negotiate a parenting plan or something like that. And if I'm in a courtroom, sometimes the opposing counsel or the judge thinks I'm the client or the defendant. Literally had opposing counsel standing next to me and I'm in a suit holding a briefcase. And then he's like, here's my client. I was like, no. Sorry, buddy. Your client isn't here. He's a he and he didn't show up. Also, I am holding a legal pad and a pen and a file. Like, clearly not your client. I've had judges think I was a defendant. I've had clerks, back before e-filing when I had to check out a file, look at me real quizzically like, are you sure you're an attorney? And I'm like, yes, I promise. We didn't have bar cards in Iowa. That was part of the problem. But I had to convince folks that, I am actually a JD with a law license. Like, this is actually a thing. But a lot of times I walk into, like I said, a conference room and opposing counsel, or just talk to them, now it's Zoom, right? And opposing counsel doesn't take me seriously or thinks that they can get away with a lot of the things that they won't be able to get away with. Because despite what they may think, I am actually pretty good at what I do. So I have to kind of combat that bias that comes out towards me. Now, towards my client, I can handle that, right? And a lot of times I use the element of surprise of like, hey, you thought you weren't going to get much out of me, but gotcha. And now I wiped the floor with you in court. So, to me, that's fun. It's a game, right? For my clients, it's a little bit more serious. I've had instances where, I do get a lot of Muslim clients because they want somebody who they feel will understand what they're going through a little bit better. And I completely understand that. I do have quite a few marginalized individuals, folks from different racial and religious backgrounds who are my clients, both in the legal world and in the birth world. In the birth world, for my client interaction, it's a little bit easier in the sense that, like, I tell them, if there's anything specific to your religion or your culture, let me know. We'll make sure we incorporate that in your birth setting. If there's anything that we need to let the doctors and the nurses know, let me know. We will definitely make sure that they're aware of what your cultural or traditional needs are. And we'll take care of that. You will still come up with instances where doctors or nurses are maybe not culturally competent enough to understand that when a client says they're in pain and they've got some biases that make them think, oh, that pain isn't as severe as they think it is. And women generally deal with this anyway, right, in medical settings. But there are some times where we have to overcome that. In the legal world, I've seen, less favorable outcomes sometimes towards clients, or just clients generally feeling like the judge wasn't even looking at them. They weren't really listening to what they were saying. You can see it in my clients' faces sometimes where they're trying to tell their story. And a lot of times judges just don't have time. But the reality is they also are not very culturally competent. They don't have meaningful training that they're doing. You've got like a couple credits a year that we have to do, right? It's not very much. It's not anything that they're going to remember from one year to the next anyway. One instance in particular, I had a client who is Arabic speaking. She's from an African country, but Arabic speaking. And if you know anything about Arabic, it's a very expressive, very dramatic language, right? So even in terms of endearment, you're like, my heart, my eye, my body, my soul. Like, that's how you talk to your children. It's literally, they are your everything. They are you embodied in a smaller being, and you would die without them. Well, my client told that to her son. She said, I would die without you. The social worker understood that as she had suicidal ideations. Without understanding anything about the Arabic language, that's what the social worker understood. That's what the social worker, it was either social worker or GAL, presented to the judge. That's what the judge understood. My client lost custody and ended up with visitation. This was right before, so she had a different attorney at the time. She came to me for the appeals. So she lost that case. And unfortunately, there were things that had happened that we worked on her appeal, but it wasn't going to have a positive outcome for her anyway. But when you have perceived or implicit biases coming through because you don't understand the cultural nuances of what that client is trying to express, or what that client's traditions are, or what that client's language is. I mean, speaks English fluently. It wasn't an issue of she needed a better interpreter. It was simply that they did not understand what that meant from a cultural perspective. I got it because, I understand those cultural nuances. But I wasn't her attorney at the time, and the folks involved in her case didn't get it, and she had drastic consequences because of it. So that's why, when I'm representing folks, it's not always easy, and I can't always get the point across because you are up against a lot of barriers of understanding. But it's very, very important to me to make sure that those things are understood. So if I have a client who's coming, with an Islamic marriage agreement, and we're trying to get that enforced in court, I have to do everything I can to help the judge understand this is what it means. This is the process. That's why it's important. Or if I have a client who, their soon-to-be ex lives in a different country, I have to explain this is the Hague Convention. This is what the cultural norm is. This is why visitation should only happen here. So it is definitely a level of knowledge and a level of experience that I have to bring, whether I like it or not, simply because that's what my clients are experiencing, and that's what they need more of. That's what they deserve in order to get an actual just and equitable outcome for them.
And it's really that we can almost say they're being neglected, ignored, just because of failure of the people who are involved in the process to learn what they need to learn. And we can then see, I know that you've told us that in the birthing process that women are often ignored and not respected during that. And I mean, I was frankly blown away because it's like, that's the star performer right there. Right. And so can you speak to how the analogy between this, or the relationship between being neglected as a woman in the birthing process with the legal process?
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I think they've kind of moved in the same direction in a certain way over the last several decades. And they're in both the medical and legal profession, there's at least a veiled attempt to kind of come back. So for the medical profession, for example, midwives were the common thing, midwives and doulas. And then the medical profession kind of took over the birthing process, it became much more of a medicalized process, which then led to, knocking folks out when they were having babies and they woke up not remembering anything happened. And then that got a little bit better. And then, but now there's still so many more interventions, and birth is a process that needs to be sped up if it's not moving fast enough. We do a lot of inductions at like 38, 39 weeks because of whatever reason or convenience. Sometimes it's purely just, the doctor's not going to be on call next week, so we're going to induce you now. So there's been this huge shift in transitioning birth from a natural organic process to a much more medicalized one. And of course, you have to look at mortality rates, and it has improved generally because there certainly is a place for the medical intervention when necessary. But you've also got, a time now where we have, Black women and babies have a 3-to-1 greater chance of maternal and infant mortality in our country, because there's a lack of understanding and a lack of ability to actually listen to the person who's the woman who's having, or the birthing person. So you have a very medicalized process that, like you said, kind of takes that star performer out of the equation. And you've got a person in power who has essentially control of the outcome. And that's just like the legal profession. You've got a person in power, the judge, who has control of the outcome. And if those folks in power, the judge or the doctor, don't have actual understanding of what their, the parties or the patient is going through or feeling, or, what their understanding is, then you are going to have a much higher chance of a negative outcome for everybody involved.
Thank you so much, Nadia. This is such an amazing conversation about intersectionality. Like, I think we're just weaving together so many, like, you're really brilliantly showing us how these things are also interconnected. I just have to mention a couple things that came to mind based on what you're saying. Okay, have you seen the documentary Birth? Have you seen this documentary? It's a Ricky Lake documentary. Yeah, it's older. You see 5 live births on the documentary, but they're talking about so many of these concepts that you were just speaking about the medicalization of the birth process, and really the that smear campaign against midwives, midwifery, and doulas historically. Anyway, want to check that out. And also, relatedly to what you're saying about women's pain not being taken seriously, and especially, Black women, brown women. Have you heard the podcast, The Retrievals? Have you listened to this yet? Okay,
no,
The Retrievals. Okay, yes, Birth, Ricky Lake documentary. Also, she came out with a new documentary, Birth Control. Haven't seen that, but based on Birth, I'm sure it's very good. But The Retrievals, it was a recent podcast about, it was actually profiling a story about IVF at Stanford. And there was a nurse who actually had a substance use problem, and she was taking the fentanyl that was right for the retrieval process. And so there were hundreds of women who went through that process without any, some of them without any drugs. It was like water, and they actually couldn't tell you. But anyway, it speaks to what we're Cynthia, check it out. But it speaks to what we're talking about, women not being taken seriously. And then again, like we're talking about the unconscious biases that are coming into play, and just how those can we can see these negative effects in practice if we're not conscious of that. The other thing I just want to mention, Nadia, you probably don't even know this, but when I was a practicing attorney, I was working on behalf of Indian tribal governments. And so what you're saying about the cultural competency and, the dominant majority culture not understanding this other culture, and then the negative effects of that. So, for example, Indian children being taken from their homes because it's a conception, they're living with their uncle or their aunt or their grandparents, and so this is an unstable environment, even though if we
it's all community.
Right, exactly. Like, this is cultural, like extended family lives with other. We have intergenerational households. Exactly. So that just made me think about that story that you raised. And I'm just so grateful that you're here today and we're having this conversation. I think it's really going to help people kind of expand their own introspection and contemplation. Like we're saying, just putting these connections together.
I hope so. Because honestly, that I feel like if we just if we can really examine our lives and how we are viewing and perceiving others, and then try to change that into a much more positive way. So if we don't understand somebody or something or the way they do a certain thing, okay, well, instead of being afraid of that, or instead of being, questioning the legitimacy of it, learn about it, take a minute. Ask them a question. I have zero problem if somebody just walks up to me in the middle of the street and is like, hey, why do you wear that on your head? That doesn't bother me at all. Like, at all. To me, I would much rather have that person that complete stranger come up and ask me anything, and I will answer. And even if it's coming at me it's usually not in a hostile way, but even if it comes at me in a hostile way, I will gladly sit there and patiently answer your questions, because I would much rather have a broader level of understanding, because that's how we get to start treating each other better. And that's how society gets better, than for somebody to just wonder and be unsure about and ultimately fear or not understand. So that's how we grow as a society and as a community. We have to get back to us as a community rather than us as individual beings who just happen to interact every now and then.
And and asking these questions, from my point of view, that's another manifestation of mindfulness, because you're aware that maybe I don't know what's going on, or maybe I think I know what's going on, but I may not know what's going on. So why don't I get curious?
Yeah,
and we
absolutely.
believe curiosity to be one of the mainstays. Well,
Yeah.
it's been such a pleasure being with you today. And before we close out, do you have any final words of wisdom that you'd like to share with professionals who are serving or looking to serve marginalized populations so that they can feel empowered and heard?
Absolutely. And I actually want to, my final comments, I want to piggyback on what you just said about being curious. Be curious. Ask your clients, what do they need and why do they need it? How do their backgrounds affect what they want in their outcome? Ask questions, understand, be curious about each other, but also be open-minded to how you can change your practice, how you can adjust, where you can give and take a little bit. Maybe you don't have the financial means to adopt a completely sliding scale fee or a huge pro bono project, but at least give a little bit of wiggle room. Find creative ways to make your service more accessible to the folks who need them most. Because everybody needs to encounter the legal system at some point in their life. It's going to happen, whether, in any way, in so many different ways. You get a speeding ticket, you've got the legal system. Understand that everybody's going to encounter it, and everybody needs to be able to have access to it. And same if you're, in the medical profession with births and all of that as well. Obviously, it's not necessarily everybody's going to encounter that. But in whatever you do, be curious, be open-minded, and most importantly, be understanding and listen to your clients.
Well, on that note, thank you again, Nadia Igram, everyone of Divas and Doulas in Kansas City. Look her up. Amazing advocate in the legal field and the medical field. Again, thank you so much. And
Thank
for
you.
our audience, yeah, it's been such a pleasure. And for our audience members, if you haven't had a chance to check out the services offered by our sponsors at Answering Legal, now is as good a time as any. And while you're at it, please do check out our website, legalburnout.com. We've got a host of mindfulness resources for attorneys. And this is Becky Howlett and Cindy Sharp signing off of the Legal Mindset Corner. And until next time, just breathe.